Our first couple of terms in Chapter 1 deal with how a data set is structured, and they are cases and variables. When you're looking at a data set, the cases will be like the people or the objects, like one per row of what you've looked at, and then the variables are the things or the attributes you've looked at for each of those cases. So a really quick example I do in my face-to-face sections is have students ask two people near them their favorite color, how tall they are, and how many credits they're taking, and then they also jot down their name. And then we look at that little data set and look at a couple things, which is how many cases are there and how many variables are there. There are two cases because they've asked two individuals, so each individual in each row here would be a case. And then we treat this as three variables. We've got color as a variable, height as a variable, and credit hours as a variable. We do not treat name as a variable because it's just an identifier, and that can be the case for data sets that you just have an identifier. When we're looking at variables, one of the key things that we'll see moving through the course that allows us to figure out what type of technique we would use to look at that data is whether it is a categorical or a quantitative variable. Categorical variables are also sometimes called qualitative variables, and these are variables that put people or objects or whatever you're studying into categories. Quantitative variables are also sometimes called numeric variables because they will have a numeric quantity to them, things like height. So here's a quick example looking at that UWL wants to estimate the proportion of students who own a computer, and they asked 500 students. If we look at this data set, then we'd have 500 cases each student, so our data set would actually have 500 rows in it. And then the only variable collected here was whether or not a student owns a computer, so yes or no to computer ownership. Our sample here is then the students that were actually included in the data set, so the 500 students that were asked, and we'd be thinking of the larger population that the sample comes from and that we really want to study as all UWL students. The variable then was, do you own a computer, yes or no? That is not a number. That's putting you into a category, so that is a categorical variable. And then in class we just throw out ideas for identifying an unmeasured quantitative variable. So maybe how many credits are you taking? What's your GPA? Those are quantitative. You could put lots of different things there for different quantitative variables that are numbers. And then finally, when we're talking about a thing that's being calculated from a study, if you're looking at the sample, it's called a statistic. If you're looking at the whole population, it's called a parameter. And the 500 students here is a sample, so the result of the study would just be considered to be a statistic.